Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It is November 11th, 2020, and I'm super excited to have you joining us for our continuing series interviewing legendary Mormon journalist Lynn Packer, nephew of Boyd K. Packer. If you were able to join us for our previous episodes, Lynn Packer, as the nephew of Boyd K. Packer, was able to share with us his insight into the rise of Boyd K. Packer into a position of power. And that's, of course, LDS or Mormon Church Apostle Boyd K. Packer into a position of power before he ascends into the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. That was the first episode we did with journalist Lynn Packer. The second was Lynn's own story about his early years in the church, his efforts to become a journalist, and him actually becoming a journalist for KSL in Salt Lake City and in Utah. And we talked a little bit about his interactions with Boyd K. Packer at the time. And we finished that second part talking briefly about Lynn's experience as a journalist in Vietnam. And we've had several people write in about how touched and moved they were by Lynn's stories as a journalist in Vietnam, as a Mormon journalist in Vietnam. We talked a bit about Lynn's testimony in the early 60s, his mission experience. It was a great episode. I strongly recommend you go back and watch or listen to those two. Last night, I released a part 3 with Lynn Packer, which was a short 30-minute video that Lynn has shared on YouTube. I titled the episode J. Reuben Clark, Boyd K. Packer, and the Charted Course of the Church in Education. For me, this was a really informative and interesting piece that Lynn produced as a background to his Paul H. Dunn book, because it talks about how the LDS Church in the 50s, in the mid 50s, specifically 1954, under the influence of J. Reuben Clark, Harold B. Lee, and Boyd K. Packer, sort of turned the emphasis of the church away from scholarship, away from science, away from critical thinking, towards this premise that emotion and feelings are what matters most, and that the church education system needs to stop emphasizing facts and evidence and scholarship and critical thinking, and instead needs to turn its focus towards building and growing testimonies based on emotion. It's a really important, and I hope you'll all listen to it, because it's a really important foundation for what we're going to cover today. What we're going to cover today are two things. We're going to be covering an episode, we'll call this the fourth segment with Lynn Packer, and I'm calling this Covering the Dark Side of Mormonism as a Utah reporter. So Lynn spent several years in Utah covering a lot of really dark stories, including Ted Bundy, the Lafferty brothers, and Mark Hofmann, and others. These are really serious and kind of sad stories. They bleed into the 80s, of course. And we're just going to talk about what it was like for Lynn to be a journalist talking about these really difficult things, and covering these really difficult things, not just as a Mormon, but also as Boyd K. Packer's nephew and as a Utahn. So that's going to be part 4 of our series with Lynn Packer. And then after that, this morning, we're going to take a short break. We're going to have lunch, and then we're going to come back and talk about, for some, the most significant story that Lynn Packer ever investigated and covered, which is that Lynn Packer did the investigative work to discover that Mormon General Authority, beloved Mormon General Authority, Paul H. Dunn, was not only built his reputation and fame within the church on telling false stories about his career as a professional baseball player and his service in World War II as a soldier, but also considerable affinity fraud, real fraud that Paul H. Dunn was involved with, that Lynn helped investigate and uncover. He did investigate and uncover. And that story is epic in and of itself, but it's also super important because it covers how the Mormon Church has used manipulation and emotion to persuade its membership, and how it's used power and lawyers and church leaders to suppress and hide and cover up stories. It's got it all. So that's what you're in tuned for today. It's going to be a long but gripping day. I'm on the edge of my seats. I really appreciate everyone who's joining us live on YouTube and on Facebook. We really do welcome your comments and questions, both on YouTube and on Facebook, because that always makes it more exciting and interesting. We can incorporate. And already we've got a comment from my dear beloved friend Sam Young, who writes, "Until this series, I knew nothing about Lynn Packer. What really stands out about his character is his integrity, standing up for what he believes, not sitting in silence." Amen, Sam Young. That's why we love you for what you've done, Sam Young. That's why we love your mom, Bertie. And that's why I wanted to bring Lynn Packer on today. So without any further ado, Lynn Packer, welcome back to Mormon Stories Podcast. It's so great to have you.
Good morning. Good to be here.
All right. So any quick comments about the reception of your first 2 or 3 segments before we jump into the 4th segment? Anything you want to share about that?
No, I think all of that, I think, was good background. I think that beginning today, we really get into the sort of red meat of my reporting on Mormonism.
All right. Well, let's do it. We have ready and prepared a PowerPoint presentation. So for those who are just listening on YouTube, who are just listening on their iPhones or their Android devices, who don't have the visuals, we're going to do our best to describe the images you see. But if you do want to switch over to YouTube or Facebook, you'll be able to get images that we think are going to be helpful. Again, this segment 4 with Lynn, is called "Covering the Dark Side of Mormonism as a Utah Reporter," Lynn Packer, Part 4. So let's dig in. Where do you want to begin, Lynn?
Well, right here, where we left off, I'd mentioned last time that I was a reporter for Channel 5 News for 15 years. 2 of the years I worked as the chief investigative reporter in the documentary unit. And that's where I did some of the more in-depth reporting. And one example, we could jump to the next slide, is where I reported on the so-called Ervil LeBaron murders. I won't go into detail about.
Well, Lynn, listen, this is so important because one of the things the Mormon Church is so good at, and I say this, not in a mean-spirited way, but just in truth, is there's so many really crucial seminal events in Mormon history, whether it's the 1912 New York Times article about, the Book of Abraham not being true, the 1922 secret Mormon meetings with B.H. Roberts, where the B.H. Roberts put the church leaders on notice that the Book of Mormon was not historical. To Fawn Brody, to No Man Knows My History, to so many stories that we just don't know our history. And so this is old news for you, but for me and so many of our listeners, they've never heard of this stuff. So as we go to each of these stories, if you could just spend a couple minutes describing the stories and the cases, we need to re-educate our modern people about some of these stories, because they really do speak to the influence of the Mormon Church, for good or for ill. Because, there is a dark underbelly of the church's power and influence, not just to be scandalous, but just so that we can see the full picture. The church has done a really good job of showing us how great it is, how awesome it is, all the great things that it does. What it doesn't do a great job of is helping us understand where it hurts people and where its doctrine or its theology have unpleasant consequences. So tell us about this story.
Sure. The photo that you see in the middle, and I'll describe it, shows me leading into a documentary that I did on the Ervil LeBaron murders. And you see a shot of Ervil over my shoulders. This was a report I did in 1978. Ervil LeBaron was part of a family. There were several LeBaron brothers, and all of them suffered from severe mental illnesses. They believed they were prophets, believed that they communicated with God, believed they had a mission to continue with polygamy. And there's lots of groups like that. But what was unusual about this one is that they were very violent, and Ervil engaged in murder, including murdering one of his brothers, who was a rival for leading his church. The Church of the Firstborn of the Fullness of Times was the name of it. Right around 1978, he was in prison. He had been imprisoned in Mexico, and he had put contracts out on other people, not just his relatives, but others. And let me talk about a couple of other people, the shots that I put in there. On the right side, you see where I'm walking out of court with Alex Joseph, who was a rival polygamous leader. Now, Alex was not violent, didn't have anybody killed, but because he was a rival to Ervil LeBaron, he was always armed when I interviewed him. Interviewed him at his house one time, and he had a loaded 9mm handgun sitting on the refrigerator just in case, and he had reason to be in fear of his life. Of course, Ervil had put out the contract on Rulon Allred, who was a peaceful polygamous leader in Salt Lake City. On the lower right, you see an interview I'm doing with Ross LeBaron. This is, I believe, older brother to Ervil, who also claimed the right to head up a polygamous church. Ervil, I guess, never saw him as a really strong rival, and he didn't have many followers, so there was no hit put out on Ross that I know of. And the way I first learned about Ross LeBaron, the brother, was 10 years earlier in 1968. I just started working at KSL. I was assigned to the Capitol, and I was, working my beat, and was talking with the Secretary of State, who at the time was the person who incorporated new businesses in Utah. That's changed since. And I went in and he says, "Hey, I've got a really good story for you." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Somebody just incorporated in Utah a flying saucer factory." I said, "Flying saucer?" "Yeah, it's just here's the incorporation papers. Here's a diagram of the flying saucer. And here's who incorporated it, Ross LeBaron. And here's his phone number." So I decided to do a story on it, and I went out to his house. It was a house out in the valley, Salt Lake Valley somewhere, really, lower income area. And he said, "Oh yeah, I've incorporated because the flying saucers, which are going to be used to bring Jesus back to the earth." And he took me out in the backyard where he had some models of flying saucers, and he would flip them with, sort of like with an elastic and have them fly across the backyard. He took me inside and showed me what he said are the true revisions of LDS garments, where he had changed some of the signs on the garments that he used with his branch of this church. And then years later, in 1968, he was one I interviewed when I did this piece on Ervil LeBaron. On the left, you see me doing a stand-up in front of a jail in Ensenada, Mexico. And at the time, Dan Jordan, one of Ervil LeBaron's lieutenants and hitmen, was incarcerated there. He didn't let us do a video interview, but I was able to talk to him and take notes. And he was there because of he was suspected to have been involved in the murder of Ervil LeBaron's brother. So that's the background. And these Ervil LeBaron stories popped up regularly in the news in the 70s and then again in the early 80s.
And tell us how, so, I always want, one of the things I love about the field of journalism is that the journalists really strive to be fair and balanced and honest. I know fair and balanced, that term has been corrupted a bit in modern times, but I really do, when I listen to NPR, when I read the New York Times, when I watch ABC News or CBS News or NBC News, I really still, in 2020, see journalists trying super hard to be fair, to interview people from all sides, to try to avoid interjecting their own personal opinions and emotionality into it. So striving to be fair, I have this question about kind of people like the LeBarons, because I did read, I read the book Under the Banner of Heaven by John Krakauer, and he talks about the LeBaron brothers there.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the strong impressions I received reading that book was that they're really, number one, there often isn't a big difference between Joseph Smith and a lot of these more severe fundamentalist characters, of course, stopping short of murder. But also that a lot of these offshoots, whether it's Warren Jeffs or the LeBaron brothers or others, in some ways, the Mormon Church is responsible for them because, number one, Joseph Smith started it all. Number two, they just do what Joseph Smith did. Number three, we still have polygamy as part of the Doctrine and Covenants in section 132. And so this is kind of our mess. And so I'm curious about two things. Whenever you tried to cover things like the LeBarons or Warren Jeffs or others, what was the church's response publicly? What was their PR approach? And two, did you feel like that was responsible, given the potential culpability of the church? Again, without a desire to blame all bad things on the church. Does that question make sense?
Sure. Yeah. Polygamy is a millstone around the church's neck that simply is not going to go away. And they went through all the trauma over decades trying to become a state, and then had to, at least here on earth, try to discontinue the practice. They continued it for a while in secret, and then finally actually really gave it up. The one step that the church should have made, probably still should, is to repudiate it as a doctrine and just say Joseph Smith was wrong. And I don't think that's ever going to happen. And because of that, you're going to have these splinter groups continue to pop up. And I think for the same reason that Joseph Smith did it, it's just a religious justification to engage in extramarital sex. And there's another question you ask is what about, here I am working for the church's television station doing this in-depth report on Ervil LeBaron. The reason that KSL formed the documentary unit that I was in was to try and make sure that it could preserve its license with the FCC. And that license required it to act in the public interest and not in the church's interest. So there was always this semi-wall between the news department and the church. And over the years, that eroded with deregulation of the FCC and the onset of cable. Today, there's no way KSL would air a story like that.
What do you mean?
Well, because there's not a fear anymore of losing your license. When you have a succession of Republican presidents who believe that the owners of these licenses should be able to act in their own interest, and the Democratic presidents we've had have really not tried to restore the old power of the FCC. And then it became less relevant having a license because you had then cable that was not licensed and overseen by the FCC. And now with the internet, the thought is, hey, there's enough opinion out there. It doesn't hurt if somebody who owns a license still, like a KUTV or a KSL, acts in its own interest, and they take advantage of that.
Yeah. And it really is to the detriment of people who want to kind of understand what's going on in our state and in our church, right?
It is. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, you covered the LeBarons. How did the church, do you have anything sort of to share about how the church, dealt with this story other than what you've said?
Well, most reporters in Salt Lake knew the spokespersons for the church, and often you would get a response. I assume that that's what I did with this and got the typical response. They would have said something like that we disavow, we have absolutely no connection with these groups. We disavow and totally disagree with what they do. It's just so embarrassing. I mean,
it reminds me when Gordon B. Hinckley went on Larry King Live and said, polygamy is not doctrinal. That's something that other people, fringe people do, but it's just not doctrinal. And yet Dallin H. Oaks and Russell M. Nelson, our two highest ranking Mormon leaders today, are in plural marriages.
Well, sure. And the thing is that it is doctrinal. They didn't discontinue or repudiate polygamy as a doctrine. They just said we will quit practicing it and quit authorizing polygamous marriages. It's still there, and it's still taught that in the next life there will be polygamous marriages.
Right. All right. So, let's go to the next slide. It's entitled Dan, Ron, and Alan Lafferty, Polygamy Associated Murders.
Right. This was in about 1981. And again, this was a huge story where Brenda White Lafferty was found dead in her home with her throat slit and her baby's throat slit. And it turned out that they had been murdered by these two, Dan and Ron Lafferty, who were forming their own church based on polygamy. And both of them believed that they were being inspired and led by God. And this struck home to me because Brenda, and it was Brenda White at the time, was in the very first class I taught at BYU. She was an excellent student. She was dating Alan at the time. I thought she was going to at least start a career before she started a family. And I lost track of what happened until I heard that she'd been murdered. And I didn't cover the main crime story. I covered sidebar stories that provided more insight about how these religious groups work. And I did several interviews over the course of the next several months about that, because, and of course you read the key book that goes into the detail about the Laffertys.
Yeah, Under the Banner of Heaven.
Yeah. My belief is that Alan sort of said, I hardly knew that they were going to do this, or I didn't know anything about it. Is when I was working on the story, I interviewed Alan at length on the telephone and formed the opinion that he knew that they were going to kill his wife, but he was never charged.
And are two of them at Point of the Mountain right now? Is that right?
Well, I believe, I haven't followed it since, but I believe Ron died.
Right.
While he was in custody. He was never going to get out. Yeah.
I think he was in the same high security sort of unit as Mark Hofmann, right?
It could have been. Like I said, I didn't. Yeah. I didn't follow it after that.
Okay. Is it kind of scary to to be covering kind of murders and things like that as a reporter? Is it exciting? Is it depressing? Is it exhilarating? What's that like?
Well, we'll get to the Mark Hofmann story in a minute, and I can tell you more about how you feel covering that, because when that story broke, everybody thought that they could be a target because they didn't really know initially who was setting off the bombs.
Yeah.
Setting the bombs in place.
We have a question from a listener. E. Cornel writes, is Lynn's KSL documentary available to view?
I don't know that I ever kept a copy of it. I may have, but what your viewer may want to do is the Oxygen Network has produced a documentary about Ervil LeBaron, and I've seen the trailer. I don't know if it's aired yet or not. I haven't checked, but all they have to do is check the Oxygen Network and see if it's aired yet. And I was interviewed at length for that, and I provided part of the video that they use in it. When I was teaching at BYU, I had saved a lot of the film outtakes. That is film that you shoot and you don't use for many of the documentaries that I did, and I donated that to BYU. And they stored the film away and have just recently started to digitize it so that it's available to the public and for journalism. And the Oxygen Network, I was able to help coordinate their getting some of that video that I hadn't seen in a long time. So if and when they air it, like I said, I haven't checked, I've been way too busy. You'll see some of the video that I used in the original documentary.
Right. Okay. Next slide. Ted Bundy. Tell us about who Ted Bundy was. Give us this is one story that's getting a lot of play. Netflix and Hulu and others, for some reason, have really been talking about Ted Bundy lately. So this is a story that some of our listeners will know about, but give us just the short version.
Yeah, over the last 3 years, I've been interviewed twice by ABC and CNN for specials they did on Ted Bundy. He's one of the most famous or infamous serial killers in the United States. But he was living in Utah, going to the U of U Law School when he was first arrested. And his first arrest was not for a murder, but for a kidnapping. A girl named Carol Durant, she kidnapped at the mall. What's the name of the mall in South Salt Lake? She was kidnapped there. He was driving her away in his Volkswagen, and she was able to escape, jump out of the car and flee. And so they finally were able to figure out who it was, make an arrest. And so the first trial was for kidnapping, not for murder. And I covered that trial for KSL. And the shot that you see on the screen, if you could go back to that, shows on the left where during a break during the trial, I'm talking to Bundy and his attorney. And at the right, you see where his Volkswagen had been taken into storage. The interesting thing about that trial is that the FBI had begun processing the evidence that they got out of the Volkswagen and found traces, like hair and such, and was able to determine while this kidnapping trial was going on that he had become the #1 suspect for several unsolved murders. And of course, I was able to find that out through another KSL reporter, Jack Ford, who had excellent contacts with the police. And of course, we could not report that at that time because a trial was going on. And we didn't want to prejudice that trial because he could have been then acquitted and been on the run again. And so I learned that information while the trial was going on and did not report it until later. And so I think I was the first one to get film of the car, which has since become almost as famous as Bundy because it was used in so many of the abductions and murders. The one interesting thing that took place during the trial is that while prosecutors were putting on their evidence, I was sitting in the courtroom, and during a break, I got a tap on my shoulder. Somebody tapped me on my shoulder, and I turned around. There were two men sitting there, and one of them said, "Why are you reporting all this negative stuff about Bundy because he didn't do it?" And I said, "Well, the prosecution's putting on their case, and when the defense puts on its case, I will cover that side of the story." And then my curiosity got the best of me. I said, how do you know that Bundy is innocent? And they said, because we're the ones who baptized him. He was baptized into the church. There's speculation of whether he was trying to have his sins baptized away or whether he was going to just use his connection with the church to get more victims.
Yeah, there is a listener. His name's Josh. He writes, "Us Mormon murderinos are obsessed with Ted Bundy and his ties to Mormonism and the lack of discernment." Do you have any idea what Josh means?
Well, sure.
He says lack of discernment.
Because if you're missionaries and you're moved by the Spirit to preach to this individual, to baptize them, you say, where's the discernment? He's right in the middle of committing these heinous crimes, and you're baptizing him into the church.
Right. Yeah. Or maybe the mission president or somebody somewhere would have the inspiration not to. Do you know if he had committed murders before he was baptized into the church?
Yeah.
He did?
Yeah.
Several?
Yeah. I've never bothered to add them up, but yeah,
Right.
he was murdered at that point, just hadn't been caught.
What was it like to talk to him? Did you actually get to talk to him a little bit? And what was that like?
I talked to his attorney. If you look at the film, he's just amused by the conversation. He impressed me as somebody being cocky, as someone thinking, I'm going to get away with this. He was going to law school and was assisting in his own defense. He had his parents fly down, and they were at the trial. I think it was a surprise to him that he was convicted because it was a good case, but it was not really strong. And remember, you've got to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. My belief is that the investigators who now knew that he was connected to murders tipped the judge. It was a bench trial. There was not a jury. It was the judge who decided. And my belief is, and it would have been unethical to do it, that the judge was tipped and say, you cannot let this guy go. And so he was convicted. He went to Utah State Prison, and then the investigators, there were murders committed in Utah, but he was never charged with those. I think the police did a poor job investigating them. And so the first prosecutions of murder took place in Colorado, and that's where he escaped from jail. I covered that. We flew over after he escaped. Of course, finally ends up in Florida where he commits more murders.
There's a comment from a listener that's kind of interesting. It was said Bundy had charisma. And this is important because, when we talked about missionaries and emotion and discernment, as we're going to get to Paul H. Dunn later and Steve Young and the Osmonds, but, it's pretty clear to me now that a cancer that's kind of vexed the Mormon people is this reliance on charisma and emotionality as a source of truth. And in some ways, those people tapping you on your shoulder saying, why are you going after Ted Bundy? I felt that he's a good guy. how many people in 2020, how many Mormons, how many Utahns, how many Americans, how many people in the world are still basing their decisions not on evidence, not on data, but on the charisma and the charisma of people and the emotions that they feel.
Sure. That was his reputation, is that he was a good-looking kid. He was said to be a smooth talker, and he just had various cons. I think sometimes he would put his arm in a sling or something like that so he could approach a young woman, say, "Can you help me do something, put something in my car?" And then bam, they're abducted and then killed. And so there was testimony about that by Carol DeRonch, because she was one who was abducted but lived to tell about it.
Yeah. And my only point is that in some ways we're primed to, as humans, as Utahns, as Mormons, we're primed to give special deference to charismatic figureheads that make us feel good. And I think that can leave us susceptible to manipulation and bad things.
Well, exactly. And I know we're going to talk about this in a segment that we're going to do later, but this is part of the stranger danger warning that when I was growing up, don't take candy from strangers. And usually you imagined pedophiles, rapists, murderers as being these really sinister looking people. It just doesn't, and I don't see where it would have crossed any of Bundy's victims' minds that this was a dangerous guy. Just looked like a good looking guy that needed some help. And so they're flattered. And I think that was part of the key to his success in killing so many people.
Yeah. One of our viewers says it better than I can. He wrote, F.W. Willis wrote, "It seems as a people, we Mormons are on average more credulous, more susceptible to equate confidence and charisma with honesty and integrity." And this is true in the Bundy case, but it's also true in just affinity fraud and pyramid schemes and multi-level marketing. By all standards, I understand Utah to be by far and away the #1 state per capita in the United States for people who fall prey to scams. True.
And commit them, it's still
commit them and fall prey to them.
Yeah, it's still known as the fraud capital of the United States. And there's plenty of evidence to support that idea. On more than one occasion, I've talked to prosecutors and have pointed out that white-collar criminals usually get a lot better deal and shake with law enforcement than blue-collar. Blue-collar, they don't have a lot of money. They may not really be clean-shaven, may have scraggly hair, and they get the book thrown at them harder and more often than someone who is closely shaven, wears a suit and a tie.
Yeah. All right. This is so fascinating. Let's go to the next one. This is one that I'm fuzzy on the details. It's Emmanuel David. Emmanuel David, tell us about that story.
Yeah, this was another headline-making story where, this was 1978. Emmanuel David, the first story broke was when Emmanuel David himself, who was a self-proclaimed prophet, he had been excommunicated from the Mormon church, was a prophet, and he was found dead, having committed suicide in his car somewhere up by the University of Utah. I don't think I covered that story, but 3 days later, after he was found dead, his wife, Rachel, took their 7 children on the 11th floor balcony of their hotel. It's changed names several times. I'm trying to remember what the name of it was back then. And threw them off and then jumped to her death as well. One of the children survived. And so I helped with the coverage. Anytime John, a story like that breaks, it's all hands on deck. You'll have the crime reporter do the main crime story, and then you'll have other reporters do sidebars to fill in some of the blanks. And that was the role I played with that particular story. And because there were so many bizarre deaths and killings associated with these people who believed they had revelation, believed that they were being led by God, it prompted me to write a memo to my Uncle Boyd. And you see that you see that, well, that's the story. That's the story I did on the upper left. Part of the controversy is that this Emmanuel David was also a swindler, and he had swindled several members of the Tabernacle Choir. And that's an angle to the story that rankled a lot of church leaders. I mean, besides the fact that you have a cult leader who was a Mormon, who believed in polygamy, committing suicide, and his family and his wife engaged in these bizarre murders. But there was also that Mormon Tabernacle Choir aspect of it. And so I think in the slide.
What do you mean by that? Mormon
Pardon?
Tabernacle Choir. What do you mean Mormon Tabernacle Choir? Well,
he was a swindler. He raised money by running these scams, and he ran scams, and so there were some members of the Tabernacle Choir that fell prey to the scams.
Got it. Okay. There's a I think your video is frozen. At least it's frozen for me. I'm not sure if you can stop it and start it again, or if there's something. But while you're playing with that, I'm just gonna read a comment from a listener because I think it illustrates a pretty important point. JD writes, there's an issue with Mormonism and a lot of revelatory groups where one believes that the thoughts in their head are there usually because of the Holy Ghost. This is at odds with reason. And I think that really is an important point to make, because if people believe that, thoughts that come into their head are from the Holy Ghost, that God can communicate with us through thoughts in our head, then if you have crazy thoughts or unhealthy thoughts, instead of saying, whoa, I need to see a therapist, if you've been primed to think that God communicates with people by sending thoughts to their head, then they are potentially more willing to act on those dangerous and unhealthy thoughts, thinking that they're truly from God. And so, I'm not saying that all bad things that happen within a religious context are religion's fault or the church's fault. But what if people were primed to believe that if they have a thought in their head that says anything that violates the law or that could hurt anybody, they're to go to a mental health unit, not there to believe it as having a divine nature? Could that change some people's behavior that happens to harm people? I think it's fair to at least ask that question. All right, Lynn, we got you back.
Okay, I switched.
Did you hear what I just said?
Yeah, I did, and I agree with that, and that has to do with the memo that I sent to my uncle. So if you go to the next slide, I think it's on there. I'll move ahead and see if I've got it. Yes,
here it is.
Okay, so what I did is shortly after this incident takes place is that I sent Boyd a several-page memo, and I kicked off the memo by saying, and I'll read it for people who can't see it on the screen. It said, some may believe that a few persons receiving false visions is the price which must be paid in order that all have the opportunity to communicate with the heavens. The quest for personal revelation, however, can hurt more than the erratic fringe. So I'm saying that basically that you have the erratic fringe that really is the problem is exacerbated when you're told to pray and get a revelation and you hear voices like you're talking about. And then I said, many seek personal witnesses and don't experience anything. Mormons without testimonies are second-class Mormons. Then I go on giving several examples that I've run across as a reporter. And then if you go to the next slide.
Really quickly, some of my listeners are saying that my voice is echoing. Is it echoing for you, Lynn?
No.
Okay. Listeners, if you guys are hearing my voice echoing, I need to know that so I can so that I can change it. So please quickly comment either on YouTube or on Facebook so that we can make sure. Lynn, while you're saying yeah. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to the next slide.
Okay, in the background there, you see several pages of notes I typed up, obviously, when I met with Boyd in his office. And I should point out that KSL at the time was on Social Hall Avenue. And it took all of like 5 minutes to walk over to 4070 South Temple. And so a couple of weeks later, I get a call from a secretary, Elder Packer would like to talk to you about this. And so I went over to his office and we discussed it at length. It was a long conversation, he said a lot of interesting things that there's not time to get into detail about here, but I'll sort of stick to the main point. Bottom line is, he said it's impossible. Even though there's this downside, there's this lunatic fringe that gets sparked by the church's belief and preaching of personal revelation. He said, we just can't quit emphasizing it. And it has to do with things we've discussed and we'll discuss about the importance of getting a witness, of getting a feeling or hearing a voice or something. And then I said then in response that I saw two main problems: those who see visions that are not genuine, and members under pressure pretend to gain a witness or testimony. So I'm telling him these two, and then he said there's a third, and he said those who get information from a false source. And then he mentions Ervil LeBaron's name at that point, because like I pointed out, he was in the news. And of course, the difference here between Boyd and me is that he believes that when an Ervil LeBaron hears voices, it's the devil speaking. And I've long formed the opinion that when somebody like Ervil LeBaron hears voices, it's because he's psychotic and the devil plays no role in it. And then going back to the slide, one thing I will share that I was impressed with, frankly, is that he told me this story about a family who brought their daughter to his house to get an evil spirit cast out. And he said others came along to see the sideshow. And so what he was saying is they were coming to see him heal this girl who somehow was being influenced by the devil. And he said he wouldn't give her a blessing. And what he did is he made arrangements for her to get medical help and to have her father released so he could focus on that problem. And I think that usually is the correct response. It reminds me of a time on my mission that I had a member come to me. It was one of the times when I was branch president. And she was with her family. She said, I need a blessing because I'm going blind in this eye. And I was curious, have you seen a doctor? And she said, well, I saw a doctor for my other eye. Or no, she said, I haven't seen a doctor, but I had the same problem in the other eye. And I came to the elders and they gave me a blessing. And I said, what was the result? And she said, well, I lost vision in that eye. So she was coming back to get a blessing to save vision in her other eye. And I said, I will give you a blessing. But first, I'm going to insist that you go to the doctor. And about an hour or 2 hours later, I got a phone call and said, you've got to get over here and give her blessing because she's being put on a plane to go to a specialist and get emergency surgery. So what had happened is she had substituted prayer for medical treatment. And I think Boyd was basically aware of the same thing, that even though he believes some of these spirits or some of these voices are evil, he realizes some of them are generated within the mind of the person themselves, and so insisted that she get medical help.
Yeah. On the one hand, I'm impressed that an apostle in the 70s is referring someone to getting medical help. If I'm actually putting myself in the shoes of an apostle, of course they don't want to actually be put in the position of having to heal somebody in front of other people, because when it doesn't work, everyone's going to know that the apostle didn't have the power that he claims.
Sure.
But more broadly speaking, what's more impressive is if apostle were to go on general conference and say, yeah, we really don't have the power to heal people, and neither do you. You know, if you're hearing voices in your head, or if you have the perception of someone being, possessed, or even if you have cancer or some illness, priesthood power isn't the way to get healed. It's to go to your local medical professional. That would be more impressive, because again, I think apostles are disincentivized to actually perform healing blessings, because then everybody's got the stories of when it actually didn't work. Does that make sense?
Makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So really quickly, so in the 70s, did Apostle Boyd K. Packer know that you weren't really an Orthodox believer at this point?
Yeah. Yeah. And even in that memo, I labeled myself as a liberal Mormon, and he knew, and I think he knew what it meant, and it was a stronger term back then than it is today.
And yet he was willing to interact with you and not just ignore your letters, but respond. What do you think made Boyd K. Packer willing to respond to a non-believing family member's questions that called the church's truth claims maybe into question a little bit?
I think that there was a mutual respect that developed despite the fact we were far apart on a lot of doctrinal issues. And he told me other things in that meeting. It went on a long time. We discussed a lot of different things. And at one point, I won't tell you what it was about, but at one point I said, why don't you say this over the pulpit? This really makes sense. And he said, I can't. He said, our words are so often misconstrued and misused that we have to play it safe. And I think that's unfortunate, because I think some of what he should have said makes more sense than some of the things that he did say, like about gays.
And we're gonna cover that later, right? Things he told you about that.
Maybe there's what happened is over the years I had lots of conversations with him, and after the conversations I would type up my notes, and I saved them in a folder, and it's about this thick. And I always thought someday I may do something, put them all together. But I've been sharing with you bits and pieces of things that he did not say publicly.
Yeah. So a couple of things that reveals. One is that, if Boyd K. Packer's telling you that some people get information from Satan or the adversary, it does show that he did believe, in core Mormon doctrine as a very sincere believer, or he wouldn't believe in an adversary giving false messages, right?
Sure. Yeah.
But it also shows that he observed, this practice of there are things we say publicly, and then there are things we say privately, but there are things we can't say to the membership, right?
Right, because you have too many members who will misconstrue it or go off the deep end in some way, and they want to avoid that.
Or not all things that are true are useful, which he's famous for saying later.
Sure.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, should we move on to Mark Hofmann?
Yeah. this was, there's one slide. This next slide. This is a really well-known photo that was used over and over again.
Tell our listeners just the base story of Mark Hofmann.
Well, what happened is he was at Utah State up there in your neighborhood, up at Utah State, and he started. He took a great interest in Mormon history and Mormon records, and discovered that there was big business, a lot of money to be made if you could come up with Mormon documents. And so he started forging a lot of them and selling them on the, there's collectors who go after this stuff, like first edition Books of Mormon, any letters, anything with signatures of important Mormon historical figures. And he ended up selling or giving, it's a process that went on, some of these to the church, some of which the church secreted away without saying that it had in the church's vault. But in any event, this one that you see in the photo is one that, I can't remember which one it was. You see in the photo is one that he gave to the church. Everybody was excited about it because here's something that Joseph Smith produced years ago. It's a very important find. And somehow the church PR decided we're going to have these key leaders looking at it. And you see the who's who of Mormon leadership in 1980, including President Kimball and Nathan Tanner, Romney, Hinckley, and my uncle standing in the background. And I'm sure later when this story broke, my uncle wished he was standing behind that curtain that you see behind him rather than in front of it. Because here you're seen with not only someone who is a major swindler, but also later a murderer when he tried to cover up his crimes. And this was, you could go to the next slide.
Really quickly, you're probably going to cover this, but I just want to make sure we're explicit about it. There's at least 3 or 4 problems that are really encapsulated in this picture. Number one is that the church is trying to secretly purchase and hide historical documents that it believes will be harmful to its members, right?
Well, yeah.
That's number one.
Mm-hmm.
Using tithing money. That's number 2.
Mm-hmm. Number
3 is they clearly lack the spirit of discernment because this guy ends up being a murderer and he's a fraud and they don't have any clue. And it's not just one of them, it's all of them. Now those are at least 3 problems I have with this photo. Are there any others, key core themes that I'm missing?
It's why it's so embarrassing. And of course, Hofmann understood. Hofmann was, as near as I can tell, a liberal Mormon, and had very quickly come to disbelieve in the church and figured out that if you fabricated these sensitive records, that it would stir a lot of excitement. They would be worth a lot of money. And of course, in this case, the church bought and publicized, or they used donors to buy and donate and publicize, while some of them were put away in the vault because they were considered too sensitive. And basically they were caught trying to cover them up. And you need to think that they're genuine if you do that. If they're not genuine, you just expose the guy for what he was, and that's a fraud.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is something we're going to cover with the Paul H. Dunn story as well, just how the church uses lawyers and PR to coerce and hide information from its membership. And it's a really seedy, unfortunate thing. Okay. So the next slide.
Well, the next slide this is part of my coverage of the story. At the time this story broke, I was working 3 days a week at BYU, teaching, and 3 days a week at KSL. And because I had heard about Hofmann documents and knew some of the people involved, had not done a story, but just knew about it, right after the first bombs went off, I was down at BYU and was called to get to Salt Lake and get to work on this story. And so I became, there were probably 4 reporters who worked the most on it. I think Jack Ford and I did most of the work. He had really good police contacts, but I think I may have been the lead investigative reporter on it, if not close to it. At one point, as we got into the story, I had a vacation with my family for a week planned in Hawaii, and I was told you can't go. This story is too hot, it's too competitive, and I had some sources inside the prosecutor's office that we relied on to stay ahead of the competition. And so KSL, it was really to KSL's credit that there was little attempt to censor anything early on. Now that happened later, but early on, we were pretty much free to report whatever facts we came across. And on the right, you see me at Hofmann's attorney's office, Brad Rich, and he permitted me to come in. We said, we want some shots of you consulting with Mark. And so I did an interview with him. I was not permitted to ask Mark any questions. And at this point, it was unclear who set the bombs off. He was the prime suspect at the time, but the police had not made that known at the time. And Brad Rich even thought that he was innocent. And there were other suspects who possibly could have done it. And of course, later he is charged, and the evidence is overwhelming as they build the case that he indeed not only had forged the documents, that there were forgeries, but that he had committed the murders. The shot you see on the left is during a break during his preliminary hearing. I'm just chatting with him while he's waiting for his dad to pick him up in the car, and of course getting a few more shots that you use.
And so you've spoken with Mark Hofmann.
Yeah.
And if I'm right, those crutches are when he injured himself by the bomb exploding. So this is after the murders, but before anyone had any idea. They all thought that somebody else tried to kill Mark Hofmann, when in reality his own bomb went off.
No, you see him sitting in the office where I interviewed his attorney, but did not talk to him. He had crutches then, maybe even a wheelchair at that point, because this is early on. The shot on the left is late in the game. He's already been criminally charged.
Okay.
He still is recovering from the injuries that he had. It was also near where he's standing that I interviewed an individual who gave him a priesthood blessing. I think on the spot, right when he was taken out of the car. His car blew up. It was over by Deseret Gym. His car blew up, and he was injured, but he got a blessing right after, and the person who gave him the blessing was called to testify. Now, I don't know why my phone's ringing. The preliminary hearing, after the preliminary hearing, he pleads guilty. So there never was a trial. And there was a lot of speculation whether Gordon Hinckley, who had a lot of contact with Hofmann, was going to be called or not. And to this day, there's this belief that Hofmann cut a deal and that the church authorities were participated in it, that he would avoid the death penalty by pleading guilty and avoiding a trial and avoiding any further embarrassment that the church could get by having his defense attorney call leaders of the church to the stand. And so it looks like, of course, he attempted suicide once a few years ago.
Attempted suicide? Is that what you said?
Yeah, at Utah State Prison. there was, I think I've remembered it correctly, that there was one suicide attempt, but it looks like he's going to go to the grave with the full and detailed story about this scam going with him. I made a couple of attempts to talk to his attorney a few years after he went to prison to see if he would grant an interview, and it was absolutely not. It's not going to happen. And so far, it hasn't happened. And it would be a huge scoop if any reporter could accomplish doing that.
What was it like? I'll just say this, that my dear friend, Tyler Measom, filmmaker Tyler Measom, along with Jared Hess from Napoleon Dynamite, are in the final stages of releasing a Netflix documentary series. I think it's a 3-part documentary series on Mark Hofmann. So that's going to be coming out, let's just say, in the spring. And we've talked about it a bit, but it's going to be really good. I'm super excited about it. For everyone who don't know, burn this into your brain. Hofmann is spelled Hofmann.
Right.
Everybody spells it Hoffman, and it's Hofmann. What was it like to talk to Mark Hofmann, Lynn Packer?
We just chatted. I would have, there's some reporters, if they get that close to a suspect, they will like say, okay, did you really do it? Are you guilty? Or why did you do this or that? I'm not one of those jump behind the bush with a rolling camera type of reporters. So I was just, we were chatting about something, but it was not the case. Yeah.
And in this photo where you're with him after he's charged, do you believe that he's a murderer in this photo?
Yeah. Yeah.
And what's that like to be standing next to a guy you know is a murderer?
Well, it was like when I was standing next to Bundy at a time where I knew what the public didn't, and that's that the FBI had fairly credible evidence that he had committed multiple murders using his Volkswagen. Is that it was like when I interviewed Dan Jordan in prison. You're talking to somebody that you know that there's, again, really good evidence that he committed the murders, and you're talking to him, and it's reporters and journalists often are in that situation.
And again, I, on the one hand, don't want to blame all bad things on the church. On the other hand, I'm just going to say that when you learn more about Mark Hofmann, you realize that he probably lost his testimony on his mission, if not before. Mm-hmm. That he believed that the church was hiding and misleading people. Sure. And even though he sincerely loved making forgeries, and he was probably a sociopath on some level. And when I say sociopath, I mean the personality disorder called, I'm spacing on my psychology, antisocial personality disorder, which is, the general understanding of it is that you don't have a conscience, that you don't feel for other people. While he may have had that, he was also fighting against a church that he believed and that in fact was deceiving and manipulating people. And it had to have given him some pleasure to be making a lot of money by selling the church fake documents that he knew the church was scooping up to continue deceiving the membership. There's some sort of sinister, arch evil dude who's kind of like playing the church for its own deceptions. And I just want to say that the Mormon church isn't guiltless in murders or catastrophes like this, because they're complicit by their behaviors of hiding, deceiving, manipulating, purchasing, using their money and power to continue a century and a half of deception. Is that fair or not fair?
No, I think you're right. And I would call him a sinister genius. He not only understood all the problems with church history and the church's desire to cover it up, but he had these remarkable skills to create documents that looked real and deceived a lot of experts.
Yeah.
But one of the interviews I did during this time period was with Gerald Tanner, and I think you've interviewed Sandra Tanner before, and they never believed that these documents were genuine because they they weren't document experts. They didn't determine that they were forgeries. They determined that they were not genuine based on their content, that it just didn't. They had studied Mormon history better than many church historians, and it didn't square with what they knew. And so they were skeptics from the beginning. And I knew that, and they were, Gerald was one of the first ones I interviewed as the story was breaking.
Yeah. Yeah. As we're talking about our frustrations with the Mormon church, we can't forget kind of the human cost of this sorts of stuff. One of our listeners, John Wetman, writes, Steve was a prince of a person. He's talking about Steve Christensen.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Let's see. He wrote earlier, Steve Christensen was a close friend and home teaching companion to me. And then he writes later, Steve was a prince of a person in years ahead of us as Boy Scouts, all the way back to junior high and Bountiful. It wasn't just Steve Christensen that was murdered. It was Kathy Sheets as well. And, you know, if ever there was a time for the brethren to make good on their claim of having the spirit of discernment, of having a connection with God, it's in a case like this where people end up getting murdered. Beloved mothers and husbands end up getting murdered. And instead of using their discernment to save people's lives, the church is using their lawyers and their money to buy up secret documents to hide them from the membership. And I'll never forget Brent Metcalf, the day that I heard him speak at Sunstone, where he talked about the day his belief in the church and in God died was the day that Steve and Kathy were murdered. Because if ever there was a time for a loving God to intervene on behalf of his children, it was in the Mark Hofmann case.
Right. And I knew who Brent was. I must have met him at some point. And so that afternoon that I came up from BYU to start reporting, he was one of the first ones I interviewed. He was living at an apartment on 4th South, I think I recall, in Bountiful. And I did the interview in front of his apartment. And he was scared, and should have been, because nobody knew. Remember, at this point, bombs are going off. You don't know who's setting them off, and you don't know who the next target is.
Yeah. It's super scary and it's super sad. And again, people like the Tanners, the church labels as evil, bad apostates, when in reality, if anyone had the spirit of discernment, it was Gerald and Sandra Tanner, and they were just trying to get the truth out.
Well, you could tell that they weren't just doing anything they could to discredit the church. If it didn't have some basis in fact, they were honest enough to not use it, because a lot of people would think, okay, these documents have come out, they're really embarrassing. They'll jump on that bandwagon, whether they believe them or not. But no, Gerald insisted these cannot be real.
Couple quick comments from our listeners. Barbie Ken writes, the documents obtained by the church from Hofmann called the succession of the priesthood authority into question, did they not? Barbie, usually a lot of Hofmann's documents were embarrassing to the church, and that was part of his scam. If he could create documents that were plausible, believable, and that would pose a problem to the church, he would produce them. And the salamander letter is the best example, where he's got one of the witnesses, or Joseph, basically, having Moroni turn into a white salamander or emerge from a white salamander, something really weird, but just believable enough to embarrass the church, and to be problematic for the church. Really quickly, DWTTXJW says, third generation ex-Jehovah's Witness here. Boy, were we all fooled by our respective religions. So glad you could join us. Shout out to all our Never Mormon listeners, Scientologists, Jehovah's Witnesses, Jews, Catholics, evangelicals. It's so glad to have you. I'm so grateful that you guys tune in. Max writes, great information about Mormonism behind the scenes activity. Thanks to you both. And I just want to give a shout out to David Welsh. David is clearly from the UK, I believe, and he used the YouTube feature to donate $10 to Mormon Stories and the Open Stories Foundation. And he wrote, keep up the good work, John, and the truth will make you free. YouTube does have a feature where you can click on a little $ under the chat, next to the chat window, and donate. Donations are how we keep all this going. So a huge thanks to David. Shout out to David for his donation. All right, Lynn, where do we go from here? This is so good.
Probably jump to
next slide.
About my next career. I'm going to.
Okay, so yeah, what's the?
A little bit, so I'm going to put a little light.
Yeah, natural light is good. What? So you were how much of this time were you actually at BYU as a journalism professor?
I was there for 9 years.
From what year to what year, basically, approximately?
It was 81 to 90.
Okay, so a lot of this stuff. Oh, by the way, you did not mention Gary Gilmore, and you didn't mention the priesthood ban and the priesthood lifting. I imagine you covered both of those, or not?
I did. The priesthood ban, we could get into that at some point, but it would probably take about a half hour. and I think we'll come, as we move ahead, there will be different aspects of it. I think we'll get into it a little bit here. In terms of Gary Gilmore, I only did a little Gilmore coverage.
Tell our listeners who he was.
Gary Gilmore had been he'd been charged with murder, but he stood out because he was going to become the first person to be executed, to get capital punishment in many years. And so it was Utah that reopened that door. There'd been sort of a quasi ban on doing it for several years. And so he was the first. And so reporters from around the nation, I think even around the world, came to Utah to see the execution. He was executed. He chose to be executed by firing squad, I believe. There was a choice back then. And I was in Minnesota covering a story the day that the execution was carried out. But I became involved in a story a few years later that involved Gary Gilmore and whether the execution had been secretly filmed. And maybe we could get into that later, or maybe not.
And for me, the Mormon tie there is that Utah, as I understand it, was one of, if not the only state in the United States that continued to do executions by firing squad. And it was because it was rooted in Brigham Young's teachings about blood atonement, and that the only way you could receive forgiveness for the really serious sins was to literally have your blood spilled.
Correct. Yeah.
And so here in the 70s, Gary Gilmore literally dies by firing squad because of teachings of Brigham Young back from the 1850s.
Sure. And he had that choice so that any Mormon convicted of a capital crime would have that choice and would have the thought that maybe I can get forgiveness by having my own blood spilled. And of course, Ervil LeBaron, that was what he was doing, only it wasn't by his victim's choice. He chose for him to spill.
He was the executioner.
Yeah.
On behalf of God.
Exactly.
Really quickly, John Wetman wants to share one more thing. He writes, I believe Steve Christensen figured out the fraud of the Salamander letter and was going to expose Hofmann, which panicked Hofmann into the bombings. The other bomb was actually intended for Gary Sheets, Steve's business partner.
I agree with that. Yeah.
So John believes, and it sounds like you do too, Lynn, that Hofmann killed these people because people were on to his fraud.
Yeah, that's what it looks like. We would have known a lot more had the case gone to trial.
Yeah,
but it didn't.
Okay, so you were a journalist at BYU for 9 years, but this would have been after a lot of these cases that we just discussed, correct?
It was after, and then of course during. I was teaching there when I did the Hofmann covered the Hofmann murder story. Is the shot on the right shows this is one of several classrooms I used at BYU. They were assigned all across campus, but at the time we were located in the Harris Fine Arts Center. For those of you who are watching that went to BYU, this is in the basement of the Harris Fine Arts Center, but I taught
HVAC as we knew it.
HVAC, right. And KBYU was located back then in the same building. And to the left, you see a student broadcast. When I was teaching, for most of the time, the students for a half hour every night produced the stories for their own newscast. And it helped propel BYU to be either the best or next to best program in the United States. It was a really rewarding and fulfilling time for me to teach in BYU's glory days. They had good instructors. We had reasonably good equipment. And the program was geared to teach practical experience and knowledge, so that when you left BYU, you were ready to shoot video, edit video, do a live shot. It was a great time to be teaching there. I would hate to be teaching there now because of the decline in journalism and the fact that more people are being laid off journalism jobs than being hired. But it was great.
A member of my student ward as a freshman, Rosemary Knighton from Boston, became one of the anchors while I was at BYU, and that was really cool to see. Yeah, that was a really cool program.
It was outstanding. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see the two men most responsible for creating the program that I came into and inherited their good work is Norm Tarbox, you see standing next to me. He recently passed, and Tom Griffith to the right was the other key player. He also is now deceased. And Bill Silcock, who didn't rise to their profile in the department, but was a key factor. And he now teaches at Arizona State. This just happens to be the only shot that I have of me with my bosses in the department head, the sequence leader. Ree Young was a visitor from a network in Korea. I believe he was LDS. And while he was there, he translated the textbook that I wrote for one of my own classes into Korean. And you see a shot of that next to us. But it was a great time, and there were really good students at BYU. And one of the reasons is so many people wanted to go to BYU is they kept raising the standards, and they used their testing and GPAs as the criteria to cut out a lot of people. I know my younger daughter who went to BYU barely made it. She barely made it into BYU. She eventually graduated from there. But so the students were bright, and plus there was a lot of competition to stay in the broadcasting program. There were so many students that wanted to be in it. When I was hired, one of my jobs was to be a gatekeeper. That is, I taught beginning, intermediate, and advanced television news. And if you didn't get at least a B in my beginning class, you were cut from the program. And I was told to grade hard and to cut students. And I would tell them in advance. I would say, if you don't get at least a B in this class, and so I would use the B- to cut out students. And so I probably was known as the Boyd Packer of instructors. I was tough. But we had to be, and somebody had to do it. And it's one of the reasons I was brought in to both reduce the number of students advancing in the program who would use all of these great facilities because they only had so much capacity, and to determine whether they were really interested in journalism or just wanted to be on television, just wanted to be a star. And,
right.
and that's what I did. It was left to me, and I did that for 9 years.
Again, ending what year?
In 90.
90. So you would have been there when Boyd K. Packer gave his famous talk, "The Mantle is Far Greater Than the Intellect," where he I think he pulled, I don't know if it was teachers or CES teachers or historian faculty, but he basically pulled all these church educators aside and taught this famous quote that not all things that are true are useful, and basically said we need to teach faithful history.
Yeah. Which
would you have been there at the time?
I don't remember. I didn't go to the devotional speeches. I didn't go to any of them. They were mandatory. And so the campus would be sort of cleared out during the time that there were either devotional speeches, but he may have made that speech in the forum that you suggest. But I wasn't paying that much attention to it because it was just consistent with everything I knew about him. The one thing about Boyd is he was consistent from beginning to end. That was his belief that propelled him into leadership. He never wavered. And as you and I have discussed before, I think that there was some honesty in his saying it in so stark and clear of terms that,
sure.
that the faith and that the heart is more important than the mind.
Yeah.
And so at least you knew where he stood and what kind of direction he was giving. He didn't try and have it both ways.
Right. Really quickly, I have a listener who asked a question, and I want to address this now. So just one second. Okay, let me pull up. So the listener writes, John, why the Thrive hat? Are you involved in the multi-level marketing business? Let me just address this directly. The word thrive represents only one thing. It represents the idea that you can, that when someone leaves the LDS church and finds healing and growth, they can end up being healthy and happy, and even healthier or happier than sometimes when they're in the church. It's simply an idea. I don't sell these hats. I'm not part of any multi-level marketing scheme. It's not even a business. I have had some events where I try and encourage healing and growth after Mormonism. But one of the things that keeps people sometimes tethered to the church in unhealthy ways is this conditioned, learned helplessness and fear that you can't be healthy and happy without the church. And my goal is not to have people leave the church, but I do want this word thrive. Whenever you see it, I want you to think that it is possible to leave the LDS church or to leave religion and find healing and growth. And that's all that thrive means. There's nothing monetary. It's not associated with any MLM. I hear there's an MLM that uses that word. It has nothing to do with me. And it never will be, because I loathe the harm that MLMs and pyramid schemes can cause to people. So I apologize, but I had to answer that question. Please spread the word. If anybody accuses me of any commercial interest, there's none. I just want people to know they can find healing and growth when they leave the church, if they feel like they need to leave the church. Okay, sorry for that detour, Lynn. Let's jump to your next slide.
So after I leave BYU, and
wait, really quickly, you left BYU. Did you leave BYU in connection with the Paul Dunn story?
Yeah. So we can get into that in the next.
But get for people that haven't, or just give the 30-second version so that they know what happened.
That version is that I was hired or rehired annually. You'd sign to an annual contract, and it would outline how much money you made, and basically how many classes you needed to teach. And it became known that I was doing research, that I wanted to break the Paul Dunn story. I had support from my department people to do it. They knew I was working on it, but it came to the attention of higher ups in the BYU hierarchy that I was working on it. I was called in, pronounced a bad citizen. That's the term that they used. We don't report anything negative about leaders of the church, and my contract was not renewed.
Yeah, and you feel like that was why?
Oh, it was because of the Paul Dunn story.
Because what about the Paul Dunn story?
Well, it was because they didn't want it out. They
Yeah.
believed Paul Dunn is the one who went to them and said, "Why is this guy teaching there? He's trying to report lies about me." The Jay Balliff, the one who I guess made the final decision, was friends with Paul Dunn.
And I guess we'll want to ask you at some point whether or not Boyd K. Packer had your back. But if you want to answer that later, we can talk about that later. It is a teaser.
Yeah.
Will you be addressing that later?
Yeah, we can talk about it later.
Okay, it's a teaser for the Paul Dunn episode, which is coming next.
Yeah.
Okay, so you got booted from BYU for your journalism, your integrity. Again, I just have to say, just like with the Tanners, just like with Jeremy Runnels, just like with other people, the church punishes and eliminates their truth tellers.
Well, yeah,
and that's why I call Lynn Packer a legendary journalist, because you were punished for only telling the truth.
Right. And by the way, when I had the discussion with Jay Balliff, I said, "But this stuff is true." And he just said, "It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if whether you're going to report about a general authority is true or not. You don't do it."
Really quickly, Dragonfly 520 writes, "What is the Paul Dunn story?"
Yeah, tell them to tune in. I do say it was something that I worked on off and on part-time for more than, I haven't added up the years, certainly more than 15, maybe 20.
And I'll just say that there's a BYU devotional, we're going to play it, where the person that introduces Steve Young and Paul Dunn says, today we'll be introducing Paul Dunn, who's the most beloved man within the Mormon church besides the prophet himself. And I think that's fair to say. He sold over a dozen books. He sold inspirational tapes, and he was basically this super charismatic Mormon general authority who had the world of Mormonism in his palm until it was discovered by Lynn Packer that many of the stories he was telling were made up and fabricated. And he was involved in financial affinity fraud that involved the Osmonds and other people. And that's what we're going to be talking about in our next episode. So stay tuned.
Yeah.
All right, Lynn. So what does Germany have to do with anything?
Okay. I loved almost every job I had. I loved when I worked in radio as a disc jockey, loved working for KSL, worked with great people and reporters there. Same thing with BYU. And while I was teaching at BYU, I participated in an exchange in Germany, made contact with the largest television station in Germany, WDR, which is also one of the largest in the world, and started doing just a little bit of consulting for them while I was at BYU. And
are you fluent in German?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, I was on a mission in Germany, but my fluency really came after I started doing more consulting, because it forces you to learn more than just religion, biblical, and Book of Mormon terms. You have to be able to talk about lots of stuff. And so when I knew I was being laid off and my contract was not being renewed at BYU, I contacted the person, Werner Schmidt, who I was working with at WDR, because I had the desire to do more in Germany than I was doing. And Werner had already come to Utah to go to one of the broadcast conventions with me. I'd had him come, so I knew him well. I probably even told him I was working on the Paul Dunn story. And so I said, I would really like to teach at a German university. And so he arranged it. He contacted the University of Dortmund that had one of the best broadcast and journalism programs in Germany, but the broadcast part was only radio. It emphasized radio, and set it up that I would go there and teach for a year, 2 semesters at the University of Dortmund. And the slide that you see that you can pop up on the screen, if you can get that back, is the top slide shows some of my students at the University of Dortmund. And Nicole, the student in the middle, was fluent in English and wanted to study in the United States. And I was still on really good terms with the program at BYU. So I set it up so that she went to BYU. I can't remember if it was 1 or 2 semesters. I think it was 2, and go through the program, which was great because at the time, University of Dortmund didn't have the facilities to teach broadcast news. And so she went there and then came back to Germany and has had quite a long career in broadcasting.
Nice.
But while I was at Dortmund, one of the things that they asked me to do was to begin their broadcast program. And so I taught the second semester a program, Broadcast News, sort of using a jerry-rigged camera system, doing the best that I could. And from there, they developed the program. And eventually it was similar to BYU's, where they had a student broadcast and used cameras and produced, and it just became sort of the BYU of Germany. And then in the same photos that I slapped on that slide, if you go to the one previous to that again, the one on the bottom right is because I spoke German and I like to freelance. Here I'm with a crew where I'm helping freelance a story. I'm working with another German reporter where I just made extra money by freelancing. And that's the German crew that I used. They drove a Mercedes station wagon. The crews were bigger than we have in the United States. In the US, you just have a cameraman, they have a sound man and a driver. It's very expensive, but that's who I used for that particular story. Then on the left, several years later, my boss at Dortmund, the one who hired me and I worked under, Uli Petzold, he retired. I'm here at his apartment in Berlin several years later, where I gave a presentation at the University of Potsdam. And because he was in Berlin, I said, Uli, you need to come over and watch this presentation. He did. Then we drove back to his apartment and we had a toast with those wine glasses that you see with Uli's. He's a brilliant instructor, and he's one of Germany's leading and most frequently published journalism instructors, a great guy. And about the wine is that I probably would drink wine occasionally, but my stomach can hardly take any alcohol, which is probably lucky for me. Who knows? I probably would turn out to be an alcoholic. And so the only times I drink wine, I remember when I finished a project in Munich at another television station. At the end, we all toasted with champagne, and I drank a little bit of that. And so that's the only time I drink.
Okay.
If you go to the next slide, is so that after I taught at the University of Dortmund, while I was there, I struck up a relationship with Sat1, which was the largest private television network in Germany. And at that time, their news operation was in Hamburg. Their headquarters were in, I think, Mainz, and they had offices in Berlin. I struck up a relationship and then signed a multi-year contract to consult for Sat1. And here you see me instructing the anchors on how to use a new set that I helped organize. It was built in San Diego and shipped over to Hamburg. And now I'm helping teach the US style of presenting the news to these anchors, the main anchor and the sports anchor. And that's one we did in Hamburg. Then a few years later, to the right, you see a project I did for Puls TV in Berlin, which was a local television news broadcast, one of the first ones in Germany, because they didn't have much local news there. And again, that's a set that was built in San Diego that I helped arrange and organize and flown to Berlin. It happens to be a design that I put together. It was funny. We were in a meeting where we had to design the set. So I'm there for like a couple of months to do the set. And I said, here's an idea. We could build a set around the Brandenburg Gate that's about 2 miles from here and have sort of the Brandenburg Gate look. And I said, okay, that's an idea. Now you guys come up with some ideas of what you want the set to look like. And they all point and said, well, that's what we want. And it was decided like in 10 minutes. And so the designers fly over and take that concept and turn it into a television set. And again, I did this for 10 years for several other television stations. There were a couple of other sets involved. I did a lot of training, and it was just a great time. I really enjoyed it because their journalism is a little bit different, but similar, but their way of producing news stories is really different. So I had to learn a new system in order to do training.
Let me just ask you, like, and maybe you're going to want to talk about this in the Paul Dunn thing, but since we're kind of profiling your own story, here you gave 10 or 20 years of your life or more. How many total years were you in Utah doing journalism?
Well, it was a lot because while I was consulting, I would commute. I would do most of the work. I started off with fax and then with the internet, with email. I would do that. And then I would go over like for 2 weeks, for a month. I would go back and forth. And in between, I would continue to freelance for Salt Lake City Weekly. And I've got some.
Right. And there's a slide on that. But I'm just saying, I'm trying to capture a moment, which is you had been reporting in Utah for at least 20 years by the time you go to Germany, right?
Uh-huh.
You had given your heart and soul to the profession, but also to the Mormon people. And then you kind of are exiled.
Yeah.
And I'm on the one hand, my heartstrings are pulled, wondering how that must have felt to be covering all these. And these are just a small subset of all the stories you covered. You kind of gave your heart and soul and your profession to Utah and the Mormon people, only to kind of get fired and dismissed. So on the one hand, I'm saddened by that. On the other hand, I'm kind of inspired by your resilience of you going off to Germany and just having a new adventure. Can you talk to both sides of that from an emotional perspective, from a personal perspective?
Well, I consider myself something like a cat that you throw out of a 2-story window and somehow he manages to land on his feet. And that happened on more than one occasion. I used to tell my students at BYU, I said, no story is worth losing your job over. I said, I don't care where you go. It's not just the Mormon church. It's a business. It's a friend of the station manager or the news director. It's going to come up. And you have to be ready to deal with that and not go storming out the first time that it happens. But also in my career, I have not wanted to lose my job over a story, but I've often gone to the edge. And the best way to explain it is on 2 occasions, because I'm sort of a car nut. I've gone to high-speed car training courses, one in Phoenix and one in California, where you learn how to race cars. And the idea is you get right to the edge of being out of control. You go around a curve, you take it right to the edge as to where you could either spin out or go shooting off the race course. And it's a skill and it's an art. And I've had that art in my career on a couple of occasions. I've careened off the track, and so I just get back on again.
So you're just resilient, but were you sad?
Yeah. It's painful. Change is painful, but I've embraced it for the opportunities it presents. And I'd had the desire to do something in Germany a long time. I was not going to career it at BYU. I probably would have stayed there at most maybe 2 more years and would have further explored, because remember, I'd started consulting in Germany. And so, but then I needed to improve my German. I wanted to continue teaching for a while. And so the University of Dortmund opportunity was just great, and just a great experience.
I'm probably just projecting here, but for me, pain doesn't quite cover it. It's rejection for telling the truth and doing your job as best as you can, and then getting rejected and eliminated for being a truth teller and doing a professional job. That's particularly inspiring and heartbreaking to me.
Well, and you're talking about something that journalists across the country and the world face. It's a lot of times the truth hurts. You attract opposition to the story coming out. There's censorship involved. You have to deal with it and fight it off. And it's a skill that if you're going to do investigative reporting, you have to develop.
Lynn, your camera's frozen for me. I don't know if there's anything you did to fix that last time.
Go to another slide, but let me just check and see why it did that and whether it's switched to I think it's your software that I think I may need to unplug the one camera, but let me, if you wanted to talk for a second.
Real quickly, we have and you can just talk if your camera's not quite working yet. John Wetman asks, have you lost any family over, your journalism work or after coming out so publicly and doing the work that you do?
The answer is no. My family is almost all, I would say, not radical, but conservative or conservative Mormons, and I haven't had a problem. I think they know why I got into journalism. They know what I do, and I think that they've been accepting of it. I could be a police officer or a fireman, somebody that they're facing danger, facing sometimes controversy, and it just sort of goes with the job. But no, I haven't, not even my extended family. We talked last time about the extended family and how I knew many cousins much better than average. And I've never had one come up and say, why are you doing this? And why are you a bad Mormon? I'm certain some have thought about it or thought it, but it's never boiled over to the point that they need to express it and express any kind of that disagreement.
Okay.
I think
I guess this deck has some final slides that just talk about some of the trailing aspects of your journalism career. Should we cover them kind of maybe quickly?
Yeah, we could just fly through them, and we give them a little insight of what's coming up. This is just shows that I've continued to be involved in news coverage, video news coverage, is that I've been writing a lot about smartphone news gathering technology, which I think is the wave of the future. And
so reporters don't have to have these big crews. They can literally have their phones, and they can have the equivalent of that whole satellite pickup and the camera crew and the audio crew, literally just a cell phone, right?
All of that. And I've written extensively about it. It's becoming more popular worldwide, but still has not advanced to the point where it's making really a big difference. And so I've been one of the advocates. I've been published in several national news outlets. And a year ago this week, I gave a presentation at a conference in Washington, D.C. about smartphone news gathering. A lot of this has been put sort of on hold because of the pandemic. And it's something that when I finish with a project I'm working on right now in the legal sphere, I hope to re-engage in. And if you went to the next slide, we can just sort of fly through these. oh, this is out of order. This just shows that I did a lot of training in Germany besides consulting. And here I'm consulting with Sony of Germany, where I went on a road show with them. And some of their technology was not geared to the German way of producing television news. And so they needed an American to come over and say, here's how you edit. You don't do it the same way as you do it in Germany. And this way is faster and better. And this had to do with editing in the field, which is becoming more popular. Then,
really quickly to our listeners, Lynn Packer's career has been so important that right now we're just taking a few final moments to let him share with us some aspects of his career. We don't want you to go away. We want to make sure you understand that we'll be taking a break very soon, and then we're going to come back with the meat of today's presentation, which is an in-depth dive into Lynn Packer's investigative reporting. You said a 15-year plus investigation into the lies and the fraud committed by Mormon General Authority Paul H. Dunn. So we're gonna finish out this deck. We're gonna take a pause, but don't go away. We're gonna restart the stream and have a very important presentation very soon. So I'm just letting people know about that. Okay, Lynn, keep going.
Okay, just keep flying through these. As I was consulting in Germany, I did lots of stories for City Weekly, won several awards. You see, I did several about the Olympics, interviewed Mitt Romney twice during that period, won an award for that. Did a really interesting story about Senator Orrin Hatch, and a companion story about Ezra Taft Benson and these odd cures that they believed in.
Sort of these herbal remedies that had no scientific basis, basically.
Mostly is based on the electrodermal machine. These, electronic machines that supposedly tell you everything that's going wrong, but it did involve some herbal cures and remedies as well.
Were these things Orrin Hatch had a financial interest in, where maybe he or family members made money off on the side from?
I don't know if he did. Since he retired from the Senate, he has had financial interest in at least one extraordinarily flaky company, but it didn't have to do with, detecting or diagnosing disease like this article goes into. And then the cover story I did on the right, I did before I went to Germany about Mormon fraud. And I think it's still one of the most important stories that have been written about how Mormon fraud came about and what it is. And it was like, it shows a cover story for Utah Holiday. Then you can just flip through, you can just go through these slides really fast. I've written, besides the textbooks that I've written 2 books. The one on the left is a novel. It's the only novel I've written and the only one I ever will. And it's my statement about Black Lives Matter, and basically was written as an apology to anybody that wanted to read for Mormonism's just what I think are really terrible racist scriptures and doctrines. Then, of course, the one we'll talk about coming up is the book I wrote about Paul Dunn, Lying for the Lord. They're only in paperback. They're not hardback at the Amazon bookstore. Then going to and I'm just sort of following this along, go to the next. The Dunn book research was more than 2 decades ago. We'll get into this. But I wanted to mention this book, A Time to Kill, for just a second. Is that while I was teaching at BYU, Ray Hillam at the Kennedy Center started writing this book.
Wait. Can I just say one comment from a listener? John Wetman writes, I was deeply over my head invested in computerized thermal imaging with, he said, Boyd K. Packer's son.
Yeah.
Does that sound right?
Yeah, I know about that.
Okay.
Sometime we ought to have a talk about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And also my cousin was involved with it as well.
John says there was huge stock market fraud, basically.
They got involved in thermal imaging.
Okay.
And so where were we? What slide were we on? Okay, A Time to Kill. So this is interesting, and I'll mention it quickly, is that Hillam had interviewed Paul Dunn for this book. It was going to be a chapter. And when Hillam found out I was doing research at BYU on Paul Dunn, he approached me and said, "What's up?" And I told him, I said, "I wouldn't put that chapter in if I were you." He did some of his own research. And not only did he eliminate that chapter, he gave me Paul Dunn's, the chapter that he was going to do on Paul Dunn, which had a couple of brand new Paul Dunn stories in it. And he substituted a chapter about me and my experience in Vietnam. So how's that?
Ray Hillam was a political science professor at BYU, right?
Well, he's with the, he moved over into the Kennedy Center and did stuff like this.
Got it.
Then you can move ahead to the next one. You can go pretty fast with these. I told you about what that is. It came out of, I've played church basketball forever. Started playing pickup ball at
How tall are you, Lynn?
Pardon?
How tall are you? How tall are you?
6'3".
Okay, so you're kind of tall.
Yeah, I could talk forever about the team that you see here. Almost everybody on the team was like 6'2" or 6'3", basically a short team for basketball, and went on one of the longest winning streaks of any church team ever. It was a great team. It was a fun team. But it just shows that I have a love for basketball, and that's why I wrote a book that involves basketball and Black history.
Right. And
you could keep going. That I've coached junior jazz basketball, and this is just one of the teams that I coached. Keep flying through, and the reason that the Black thing comes in, which really cemented my feelings about discrimination against Blacks, was my experience in Vietnam. I was opposed to the church's priesthood policy before I went there, and after going to Vietnam, it was just like, this is just it's just not right, and it's one thing that led to the book.
Got it.
And the next slide. I had a legal consulting career that I still continue with that went about 10 years. Here's a case I worked on where a doctor was accused of murdering several elderly patients. We won that case in grand style. You could flip through to some more. To the next.
And is this kind of using your journalism investigative skills?
Yeah,
in the legal realm, is that basically what you do?
With how the case is presented in the courtroom using technology, and in almost every occasion I started working on a case, because I can do it, they've had me investigate as well. On some occasions, I've only investigated. On some occasions, I've only helped prepare the technology, that's the material for the courtroom technology. But usually I do both.
Love it.
Then,
okay, Warren Jeffs.
I worked on the Warren Jeffs case in St. George. I worked on his side, was down there and helped prepare both the opening and closing statements, and was there as we prepped witnesses prior to the trial, several polygamous wives who were witnesses in the case. We could talk a lot about that, but some other day.
Okay.
I'll go to the next one. This is an interesting case that I at least wanted to mention to show how problematic Utah's legal system is, especially when it comes to custody and how custody is done. This is a case, and these are slides that I presented with my client, who was the wife to the Child Welfare Legislative Committee. It involved a man named Gordon Bowen, who's an advertising executive on Madison Avenue. He's brilliant, been involved in many big campaigns like for Coca-Cola. His father was Wes Bowen, who I knew really well at KSL. Wes Bowen did the Public Pulse radio show that I sat in for him on occasion when he couldn't do it. But this was a custody case where Bowen wanted to have joint custody of 2 children that he helped father. And I was working with his wife's attorneys to try and block that custody. And he was, in our view, not fit to have custody with young children. Like in his journal, he wrote, "God, I was living a gay life. Most of your homosexual desire has gone as evil spirits, unclean spirits have departed your body." He's talking about exorcism, where he was gay, but was exorcised, so he's no longer gay. He told his stepsons that they were possessed by spirits that made them gay, blamed their father, said they should be exorcised. And on several occasions, he induced his older stepsons to sleep in the same bed. It was a bizarre story. And if you go to the next slide, he was good friends with Gordon Hinckley, and he participated as a consultant in some of the church's advertising campaigns. He was very good friends with Mitt Romney and consulted on some of Romney's campaigns. And he consulted on the Olympics. And he's the one who came up with the Olympic tagline or theme of "Light the Fire Within." And the bottom line is that in our belief, he should have had no contact with his 2 young children, but the court gave him contact. And we think it's because he knew people in high places. And it's just a case of the legal system sometimes just absolutely fails. But if you go to the final slide, or the next one, that he talks about, and he wrote a script for some sort of movie or something. And in this script, he talks about being Christ's warrior who's taught secret combinations. In the script, he's writing this for somebody else. "I take the child in my arms. All the naked men are in their fiery furnaces doing their penis exercises. I hold her next to my chest and escape." He's taking this young child, escaping from this scenario. The court was aware of all of this and yet granted full custody. And it's just, like I said.
Do you think that like people like Gordon B. Hinckley and Mitt Romney and others knew about this stuff about him? Or do you think he just hid it from them and so they were fooled?
No, I think they probably knew about it.
And so you're saying
the guy,
Mormons in high, powerful places cover up for and or aid and abet abusers because of their power and influence.
I'm not accusing him in any way of being an actual pedophile that acts on his desires or of doing any of that. The case that we made is that because of what he's written and what he's said and what he's done by sleeping in the same bed with the older boys, that he's unfit to have joint custody. And that's the only case we made, and we failed in making that case. And I think it's because of the generally the legal system that deals with custody disputes and matters is badly broken in Utah. And it's susceptible to having somebody powerful in high places get their way when they shouldn't have it.
Yeah. Okay.
Going on.
More slides and then we'll wrap up for this session.
In courtroom technology, you can just sort of keep flying through that. Okay. One of my favorite that no viewers will be interested in is how the acorn did not fall far from the tree. Is my father early on loved to modify cars and fix them up and loved vehicles and became a mechanic. And I followed in the same footsteps. If you go to the next slide.
Is that a Porsche?
Yeah, a Porsche. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What year or model is that?
Cayman. It was a 2008. Loved the car. I've driven Porsches, Audis, BMWs, Mercedes. That's generally what I drive. But that one was a stripped Cayman, but probably my all-time favorite car that I had for various reasons. You can jump ahead. And
the guy on the left is who?
That's my father.
And what car is he posing with?
I think it's a DeSoto that he fixed all up. He put twin horns on it. That's what they did. Twin antennas, twin spare tires. They put them on both sides instead of just having them one side as sort of the twin thing. put trim rings on the wheels, and of course, polished it to the hilt. That was just Dad. And if you go to the next slides, these are projects my father and I did when I was growing up in high school. We took an old Plymouth that had a good engine and front end and cut the frame off, and then took the engine and front of the frame off of this Jeep because they were popular, but the engine on this Jeep had expired, and created the Pleat. And it was a fun project. I worked on it. I did all the interior work, changing over the instruments, putting in the radio, rewiring it. It was a fun project. We had fun driving it for a couple of years and then sold it. Then the next one slide shows a project Dad and I did later where we resurrected this old Dodge truck that had been in a barn up in Deweyville, Utah, that had been used to take kids to school. And we restored that. Took 2 or 3 years just working off and on it. And then another project on the next slide where I restored an old Z car just for the fun of it, where just work on it, fix it up.
Fun.
And what it does is I'm just saying that this is part of the extended family growing up with the family owning the business Packer Motor, and being one of the cousins who takes a strong liking to doing it and doing what my dad did, working on cars.
Well, Lynn Packer, it's super fun to take a trip down memory lane with you, but even more so, it's just I just, on behalf of the Mormon people, on behalf of Utahns, I just want to thank you for your, what I would say, illustrious and/or legendary career, because you covered a lot of really important stories, and you've given us a lot. And the story that we're going to cover next, which is the Paul Dunn story, is one that really impacted me personally. I was at BYU, from 87 to 93. So that story touched and impacted me very directly. And so just on behalf of Utahns and Mormons and post-Mormons everywhere, can we just take a minute to thank you for all you've done for us?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
All right. Well, all right. So anything you want to say to close, Lynn, or should we just
I'm anxious to dive into this other story because it was a wild 25 year ride.
All right. So listeners, thanks for joining us for, these 2 hours with Lynn Packer. We're going to take a lunch break, a potty break, and I'm guessing, in around 30 minutes or so, we're going to start up again. And we're going to dig deep into the story of Paul H. Dunn. He's the second, he was probably one of the most beloved general authorities in Mormon church history while he was alive. And while he was a general authority, he was considered the second most beloved general authority next to whatever prophet was still alive at the time. And turns out that these fantastic stories about playing baseball for the St. Louis Cardinals and having his buddies die in his arms in the war, and all these stories were made up. And he also was engaged in affinity fraud where people lost a lot of money, and he used his fame and reputation to advance commercial interests. And he was ultimately put on emeritus status. And I think that probably changed a lot about church culture and general authority worship culture, but not totally. But it was Lynn Packer who did the investigative work as Boyd K. Packer's son, the nephew, lost his job at BYU as a result of it. And the story was hidden. And the Paul H. Dunn story is not just fascinating because of Paul H. Dunn. If you want to understand Mormonism today and the way it wields its influence with the media, with power, with lawyers, with cover-ups, with coercion and intimidation, the Paul H. Dunn story is a great example of what the church does now. And now that there are less restrictions on journalism, less vibrant news channels and newspapers, the church is probably, you could argue, doing this sort of activity more now than it actually did back then. And the Paul H. Dunn story is a perfect case study of the Mormon Church's tendency to use power, money, lawyers to hide information from its members, to kill stories, and to avoid coverage of deceptive information. And so, is there anything I'm leaving out in the story, Lynn, as a preview?
Oh, you've given it in a nutshell.
All right. So stay tuned. We're going to be coming back in about 30 minutes, and we're very eager to tell the story of Paul Dunn as told to us by Lynn Packer. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Lynn. Go get some lunch, and I'll see you in about 30 minutes.
All right.
Thanks, Lynn. Thanks, everybody. And if you've enjoyed today, and if you want to see more episodes like this, please consider donating to the Open Stories Foundation. You can go to mormonstories.org. You can click on the donate button, and you can become a monthly donor, $10 a month, $25 a month, $100 a month, whatever you can afford. Your donations will keep us alive and will allow us to continue. Every year we have to look and say, can we keep going or not? And as long as people donate, we'll keep going. Your donations are tax deductible in the U.S. We're transparent in our finances. 100% of your donations go to keep this program alive. And you were governed by a board in I believe, a responsible, transparent way. So please share. If you want to donate through YouTube right now, you can click on the little $ donate through YouTube, and those donations will reach us as well. I have a listener who says, John says, I have a huge Paul Dunn story and Grant Affleck story from my home ward connection, but I'll shut the heck up now and watch. So, John, we want to hear that story later. Thanks to all you guys who have joined us today, and we'll see you guys in about 30 minutes for another episode of Mormon Stories Podcast. Camille writes, Lynn, thank you so much for your story, and thank you for standing for actual truth and righteousness. And thank you, Camille, for sharing your thanks, because Lynn does deserve our thanks. All right, everybody, you guys take care, and we'll see you guys again soon on Mormon Stories Podcast. See you soon. Have a good lunch. Take care.